So in the course of doing our work, we became quite aware and exposed to the good work that's done elsewhere and can learn from this. So earlier there was a question about what about Europe, what about elsewhere? So what we learned, of course, is that OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, have actually efforts in looking at technology governance. And so it's my great pleasure to ask David Winikoff, who's been working with us, to talk about what's happening, in fact, in the other countries. So he's zooming in from Paris. He'll put our efforts into a broader perspective about international context. He's the head of Secretariat of the Working Party on Bio, Nano, and Converging Technology at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD. So they work in both soft laws, but also policies and others. And so David's going to talk to us a little bit about what's going on in OECD. Welcome, David.
Thanks so much, Victor. And can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to share my screen. And is that visible?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Can you see it in presentation view?
No.
Or into full screen? Okay. There we go. So, Victor and other colleagues, it's a pleasure to be with you today from Paris. I wish I could be there in person. But my intent today is to give you a bit of an overview of what the OECD is doing in the area of technology governance, suggest some synergies and maybe some ways forward. I'll be riffing off this idea of the ecosystem in the talk, especially given how frequent it's come up in the meeting so far. In the talk, I want to do three main things. I want to talk about what science, tech, and innovation policy at the international level is through the eyes of the OECD, and argue that we need to be taking into account the international dynamic as part of the multi-level governance ecosystem. I want to talk about a newly launched OECD framework for anticipatory governance of emerging technologies and possible synergies with the great work on the framework on equitable innovation from the National Academies of Medicine. And finally, a few suggestions on how to meet the challenge that we've heard of actually implementing principles and frameworks. A predicament that we share with the national academies. How do you move from ideas at a higher level and normative material into actionable tools? So the first point is builds on this idea of ecosystem. And I think we've heard both about the innovation ecosystem as being critical in terms of understanding where to intervene to ensure equity is embedded in the development of technology, but also the governance ecosystem from Alondra and others, and from this quote from the piece in New England Journal by Deborah, Victor, and colleagues. And the idea is that the successful adoption of a new scientific knowledge and technologies for societal benefit depend on an effective and enlightened governance ecosystem. And part of what we are engaged in is a kind of thought experiment and activity in and putting the governance ecosystem in conversation with the innovation ecosystem. And the question I guess I'm interested, or we are interested in at the OECD, is what should an international governance ecosystem look like? And what's the role for an organization like the OECD, which is a 39-member international organization based in Paris. Its functionalities include policy analysis and advice, the construction of statistical databases, indicators, and metrics, around a whole array of policy areas, convening multi-sector actors, developing international good practices and soft law in many policy fields. The roots are in economic policy, but it extends to issues of science, technology, and innovation in health, and this is a major pillar of the OECD's work. So why think about an international approach to emerging tech governance when it's, as we've heard, difficult enough to be thinking about it in a national context? Well, I think the argument is there are critically important issues of coordination, harmonization across approaches to governing emerging technology. I think we need to think about the ways we can benchmark through indicators and metrics and so forth, and to create a picture of how we are doing. We need to think internationally to minimize races to the bottom and technological tourism. We can use the opportunities in international work to develop joint evidence for the baseline for governance to attach. We need to think about building good practices and how there's benefit in sharing good practices across countries. And then also, we know that technology is global, and technologies and their financial associated modalities occur in a global perspective, and arguably international perspectives are important for governing tech. And so at the OECD, we've developed a few of those pieces of soft law that look at particular technologies, one on artificial intelligence, and one on responsible innovation in neurotechnology. And these have moral and political force, but not legal force, and they have built-in accountability mechanisms of reporting back to the OECD. So the news is the welcoming of a new international framework for responsible innovation. This was welcomed by the STI ministers in April, and the intent here is to go actually fairly broad and be agnostic with respect to technologies. In contrast to the equity framework, this group, the members, were looking at a broad array of values as being pertinent or needing to be protected in the process of governance. So I think there's a lot of good complementarity. And the other thing about this work is that, like the approach in the national academies, there was a lot of interest in addressing the anticipation, or tried to get on the front foot of technologies to the extent possible to anticipate. And so this is the anticipatory governance idea. There are 5 elements of this framework that I think are quite resonant with the framework of the National Academies of Medicine, and I think could lead to really good synergies moving forward. But first, the rationale of developing a tech-agnostic framework is that there are actually recurring issues and challenges around technologies about balancing risks and benefits in the face of uncertainty, about, in fact, how to adapt governance to converging technologies, how to rally the multilateral system to engage in cooperative governance approaches, given the acceleration of global competition. And this is a real challenge to I guess, realizing good governance when you have firms and you have countries trying to compete in the innovation business. How to address the mismatch between the transboundary nature of technology and the jurisdictional boundaries of governance and regulation, and how to make technology more effective, inclusive, and democratic. I'm not going to go through in detail, but I want to just touch on the 5 elements because I think they're interesting resonances. The members designated a set of foundational values, which include equity and inclusion, but also look at human rights, democratic values, privacy, and so forth. and then values that are being invoked around specifically in technology contexts like transparency, accountability, trustworthiness. And the point here really in the framework is not to lay down these values as kind of given by some divine intervention and down from the mount, but rather to say, here are some characteristic values that are articulated by OECD countries and beyond. Let's prioritize having debate and discussion of these values to try to figure out which ones should apply or how they should be applied in particular cases. The other point is that the embedding point is really central. So there's a lot of agreement here that, in fact, if you're thinking about anticipation and for achieving good social outcomes, you should be thinking about multiple stages of the innovation process. And here we highlight agenda setting and R&D design, research and development, early commercialization, and diffusion and deployment, and how values must pervade these different phases. So very, very nicely fits with what you're doing. We have an element on strategic intelligence and sort of a rolling three-step process around horizon scanning, around doing preliminary diagnosis of the kind of impacts of a technology. This works very well with heat map, which is a great tool for doing this kind of thing. And then ideas around extended appraisals. And the idea that we argue is that countries need to build their capacities for the strategic intelligence itself. Not just do it, but we need to think about the ecosystem of institutions doing technology assessment. How do those fit together? How can those be enhanced? Because we're trying to build a larger capacity of society to do this kind of assessment. On stakeholder engagement, it's come up a lot today. I won't belabor it, but we in the document try to talk about three different modalities. One around capacity building through education, resources, media training, foresight capacities, and then one on communication and consultation, and then one really on co-creation. So participatory agenda setting and tech assessment, citizen science and science shops, fab labs, living labs, transdisciplinary research, and collaborative platforms of various kinds. The framework talks about agile regulation and the need to implement adaptivity and iterative regulatory assessment cycles. The use of experimental tools like test beds and regulatory sandboxes for adaptive policy learning, outcome-based, and engaging and incentivizing the private sector early on to use tools like ethics by design or responsible business conduct approaches. And on international cooperation, just enhancing the argument that forward-looking dialogue is necessary, that's inclusive and multilateral, and that it would help to develop common analysis and agreed forms of evidence in order to help gird, underline, or support common approaches to governance. We developed, of course, the idea that international cooperation in science across countries is essential for developing and bolstering shared approaches to ethics, and also developing the international norms based on values. So turning now to how to put frameworks into action. This is the National Academies has done some really nice work in this report. At the OECD, we're also thinking about this idea of how to implement and how to make good on recommendation 6 in the report about developing context-specific guidance on translating governance frameworks for emerging science, tech, and innovation into practice. And so this idea of playbooks is very interesting and pertinent. At the OECD, we've been doing this, trying to think this through ourselves and developing in the neurotechnology area what's called the Neurotechnology Policy Toolkit, where we take the general framework, we have an associated set of principles around a particular tech. So moving from a general framework to a specific framework on a tech, and then drilling down into guidance to realize, actualize, and translate those principles. So we have a kind of a clickable toolkit where we have a set of the five elements just outlined. You can click on guiding values, and you see 5 different guiding values. You can click on each of these. I'm going to click on ensuring inclusion and access. I'm not actually clicking on it live, but to just show you. And there are a set of possible actors, especially looking at funders and what they can do to ensure inclusion and access. And then examples to consider. So looking across countries at important ways in which there have been activities or actions in this regard. How we got there was a lot of meetings, a lot of thinking. We had to sort of invent as we go. I guess we wish we would have had the National Academy's report earlier, but this is it's a long work, and it's a collaborative work across sectors. Another example of implementation is the AI Policy Observatory, which collects policies in a searchable format, is a platform for experts across sectors to develop new policy work in AI, and develops the classification system for AI. So this is another way of kind of taking principles into practice. In terms of following sort of possible ways forward, a kind of let's work together statement. I think that we could, with our communities, co-develop these implementation resources. I like how National Academy talks about thinking about particular roles in the innovation lifecycle, types of inequality, specific areas of emerging tech. These are all possible ways to organize toolkits or playbooks. Maybe we can work on those together to fill out this multi-level governance system. Building indicators and methods to help guide quantitative and qualitative analysis and strategic intelligence with respect to key values. I think that very much builds on the idea of equity science, but you could also build other sciences as well. The creation of an international policies database with either a thin or a thicker analytical layer. The AI Observatory has some examples where you could develop a well-curated compilation of good practices. Also fostering an international network of experts on agile platforms that help build community exchange on implementing responsible innovation frameworks. This would need to necessarily engage the private sector, and would also build partnerships on toolkits in building the idea and the concept and practices of equitable innovation internationally. I'll stop there. Thanks so much, Victor and colleagues.